There was no rescue plan, only a ship trapped in ice, and a leader who understood that reaching Antarctica no longer mattered. Getting everyone home alive did. Survival story of Ernest Shackleton. Endurance, ice, and leadership when rescue is impossible, where breaking is not an option. The dream did not begin in the ice. It began far from it, in rooms thick with coal smoke and damp wool coats, where maps lay flat on wooden tables and Antarctica looked clean, white, manageable. On paper, the continent appeared empty, almost polite. Lines could be drawn across it, routes imagined, distances underestimated. Ernest Shackleton had already learned how misleading those maps were. He had been south before. He knew the cold was not just low temperature, but pressure. He knew the silence was not peace, but absence. He knew Antarctica did not reward courage or punish arrogance. It simply exposed men until there was nothing left to hide behind. And still, he returned to it, not because he believed he could tame it, but because something unfinished kept pulling him back. By 1914, the age of heroic exploration was narrowing. The world felt crowded. The poles were almost claimed. Flags had already been planted, headlines already written. Shackleton needed more than a first. He needed something that justified the risk of taking men into a place that killed without malice. So he chose an idea that bordered on madness: to cross Antarctica completely, from the Weddell Sea through the heart of the frozen continent to the Ross Sea on the far side. No resupply, no rescue, no retreat. A single, continuous crossing through the coldest place on Earth. He did not frame it as recklessness. He framed it as inevitability, as progress, as endurance. Men listened. They listened because the world they lived in was already hard. Work was uncertain. War felt close. Lives were narrow. Shackleton did not promise comfort or safety. He offered hardship with meaning, a chance to be tested completely. Thousands applied. Sailors, dock workers, engineers, scientists, young men looking for direction, older men looking for one last purpose. Shackleton read their letters carefully. He was not looking for bravado. He was suspicious of it. He looked for restraint, for humor, for the ability to exist quietly around others without breaking, because Antarctica did not care how strong a man was. It cared how he behaved when strength ran out. The ship that would carry them south was called Endurance. Built in Norway, thick-hulled and stubborn, designed not to fight the ice, but to survive it. Her timbers were heavy, her frame reinforced, her shape meant to rise under pressure rather than split apart. She was not fast. She was not elegant. She was practical. Shackleton trusted her immediately. He had to, because once they left the last port, the ship would stop being transportation. She would become shelter, heat, food storage, and sanity. Without her, the men would be exposed to Antarctica directly, and exposure was death. When Endurance left England in August 1914, the mood was light. There were cheers on the dock. Families waved. Brass buttons caught the sun. The men stood straight, clean-shaven, full of movement and sound. Shackleton learned just before departure that Britain was at war. For a moment, the expedition paused in uncertainty. He offered the ship and crew to the Admiralty. The reply came back quickly: proceed. And so they did, southward. At first, the voyage felt almost ordinary. The sea rolled. Men learned the rhythms of the ship, who complained, who joked, who snored. There were arguments about food, about watches, about small things that mattered because nothing else did yet. Antarctica was still distant enough to remain an idea. That changed slowly. From South Georgia, the last outpost of civilization, the world began to narrow. The water darkened. The air sharpened. The first ice appeared not as a wall, but as fragments, floating pieces, white against black sea, beautiful, almost welcoming. The temperature dropped. Breath turned visible. Fingers stiffened. Still, optimism held. It always did at this stage. Every polar expedition began with the belief that progress was possible, that the ice would shift, that leads would open, that skill and patience would be enough. By January 1915, the ice thickened. Floes pressed closer together, scraping along the hull with a sound like teeth on wood. Endurance slowed, stopped, reversed, turned, pushed forward again. Coal burned. Men watched the ice constantly. Still, Shackleton believed they could work through it. The Weddell Sea was unpredictable, but not impassable. Others had gone farther south. Why not them? Then, almost without drama, the ice stopped yielding. On January 18, 1915, the floes closed around the ship. Not violently, not suddenly, just steadily. The bow climbed ice and slid back. Again and again. Engines strained. Orders were given. Nothing changed. The ice did not crush the ship. Not yet. It simply held her. At first, no one panicked. This had happened before to other ships on other expeditions. Temporary besetment. The ice would move. A storm would break it apart. Spring would come. They secured the ship, reduced coal use, measured drift, took soundings. Days passed, then weeks. The Endurance no longer moved through the ice. She moved with it, carried north, then south, in slow, indifferent circles. The men began to understand something fundamental. They were no longer traveling. They were being carried. Shackleton did not call the crew together to announce disaster. He never would have. Panic spreads faster than cold. Despair infects. He understood that leadership here was not about declarations, but adjustments. He shortened risks, increased routine, introduced structure where uncertainty threatened to seep in. He watched his men carefully, who grew quiet, who grew sharp, who laughed too loudly, who stopped laughing at all. Leadership in this place meant noticing who had not spoken today and why. By February, the pressure increased. The ice rose against the hull, lifting the ship slightly. Wood creaked, nails strained. At night, the ship made sounds that no one forgot: sharp cracks, deep groans, long moans that traveled through the decks and into the body. Sleep became shallow. Dreams turned strange. The ice was no longer background. It was active, present, listening. Still, hope lingered. Men spoke of wintering in the ice and breaking free in spring. Of sledging south once conditions improved. Of next year, future tense became a form of insulation. It kept fear at bay. But Shackleton was calculating something else. Supplies, distance, time. Every day trapped reduced options. Every mile drifted changed plans that no longer existed. Antarctica did not negotiate. It did not compromise. It waited. By March, the ship was locked completely. No leads, no movement. The ice had consolidated into a single mass, thick and unbroken. Endurance was no longer surrounded by ice. She was part of it. The men stood on deck, staring outward. No horizon, just white folding into white. A world without edges. They had not reached the continent. They had not even stepped onto Antarctica. And already, the expedition they had imagined was slipping away. No one said the words failure or loss. They did not need to. Shackleton felt the shift internally. The dream he had sold, the crossing, the achievement, the maps with bold lines drawn across them, was dying quietly in the cold. In its place, something heavier was forming. Responsibility. Every man on that ship was his. If they lived, it would be because of choices he made. If they died, it would also be because of choices he made. There would be no rescue, no outside help, only judgment, timing, discipline, leadership. The endurance did not move. The ice did not open. There was no forward. There was no backward, only waiting. And the slow realization that Antarctica had already decided the terms. The ice did not rush them. It did not announce itself with violence. It worked slowly, patiently, the way pressure always does. By the time winter settled fully around the Endurance, the men no longer spoke about movement. They spoke about endurance in its most literal form. How long wood could bend without breaking. How long coal would last. How long a man could pretend not to be afraid. The ship drifted silently with the pack, carried wherever the ice decided to take her. Direction had become meaningless. North and south no longer mattered. Only survival did. The sun dropped lower each day until it stopped rising altogether. Darkness became constant, thick, and disorienting. Time blurred. Watches mattered more than daylight. Routine became the only structure keeping the men from dissolving into unease. Meals were eaten at fixed hours. Work was assigned, even when there was nothing meaningful to do. Games were played not for entertainment, but to keep minds from turning inward. The ship groaned constantly now. Not sharp sounds anymore, those had been early warnings, but deep, exhausted noises. Like an animal bearing weight it was never meant to carry. Ice pressed from both sides, lifting the hull, twisting it, testing every joint and seam. The Endurance responded the way she was built to respond. She flexed. She complained. She held, for a while. Shackleton listened to the ship the way a doctor listens to a failing heart. He did not dramatize. He did not reassure falsely. He observed. He adjusted. He began quietly preparing for outcomes no one wanted to say aloud. Supplies were inventoried again and again. Food was rationed more tightly, not because starvation was immediate, but because time had become unknowable. Fuel was conserved. Personal gear was reduced. Anything non-essential was quietly labeled expendable. The men noticed. They did not argue. They understood what it meant. Morale did not collapse all at once. It cracked, slowly, in small, invisible fractures. Some men grew silent. Others grew irritable. Minor disagreements lingered longer than they should have. A joke landed wrong. A glance was misread. In confined space, with nowhere to walk away to, emotions had nowhere to go but outward. Shackleton moved among them constantly, not as a commander issuing orders, but as a presence, eating with different groups, talking casually, asking questions that seemed small but were carefully chosen. Who missed home the most? Who worried about food? Who still believed the ship would break free? He did not lie. He did not promise rescue. He did not say everything would be fine. What he offered instead was steadiness, predictability, the sense that someone was awake when others slept. The pressure increased in October. The ice began to rise higher against the hull, buckling planks inward. Water seeped through seams that had held for months. Pumps were manned constantly. Men took turns bailing, their hands numb, their movements automatic. The ship was no longer just trapped. She was being dismantled slowly, piece by piece, by a force that did not care how well she had been built. On October 24, the sound changed. A sudden crack, loud, sharp, unmistakable. The deck shuddered beneath their feet. Men froze where they stood. Then came another sound, deeper this time, like the ship exhaling for the last time. The ice was no longer squeezing. It was crushing. Shackleton did not shout. He did not panic. He ordered the men onto the ice. Supplies were hauled out. Boats were lowered and dragged across frozen ridges. Food, fuel, instruments, anything that might keep them alive once the ship was gone. Because now, for the first time, the truth was unavoidable. The Endurance was dying. For days, They worked in shifts, hauling gear out of the ship as the hull deformed around them. The deck warped, doors jammed, beams splintered. Inside, the ship looked wounded, floors tilted, walls bowed, spaces once familiar now distorted and unsafe. On November 21, 1915, the Endurance gave up. The ice lifted her stern, twisted her bow, and broke her spine. Water rushed in. The ship settled, slowly at first, then decisively. Men stood in silence as she sank, her masts tilting, her hull slipping beneath the ice she had fought for months. No cheers, no tears, just quiet. The ship that had been their home, their shelter, their future, disappeared beneath the frozen surface. Shackleton removed his hat. That was all. They stood now on the ice, 30-odd men, surrounded by an empty white world, with 3 lifeboats, limited food, and no clear path forward. The mission they had come for was gone. There would be no crossing, no discovery, no achievement to justify the suffering. Only survival remained. That shift, the death of purpose, is what broke some of them. Without the mission, time became heavier. Days stretched. Nights pressed down. The ice they camped on drifted unpredictably, cracking and groaning beneath their tents. They were no longer explorers, moving through a landscape. They were castaways on a surface that could split open at any moment. Shackleton understood something essential. Despair grows fastest in uncertainty. So he eliminated as much uncertainty as he could. He set new goals, smaller ones. Reach stable ice, conserve strength, keep the group together. Nothing abstract, nothing distant, only what could be achieved today. He also understood something harder. Hope had to be managed. Too much hope would break them when it failed. Too little would destroy them before the ice ever could. So he walked a narrow line, never promising success, never surrendering to hopelessness. He spoke in probabilities, in effort, in next steps. The men watched him constantly now, not because he demanded it, but because everything depended on him. His posture, his tone, his sleep. If he appeared confident, they breathed easier. If he hesitated, fear spread instantly. Leadership had become survival. Food grew more monotonous. Hunger crept in slowly, quietly, making itself known in dreams and irritability long before bodies weakened. The dogs, once companions, once tools, became part of difficult conversations no one wanted to finish. Every decision carried weight. Every delay cost energy. Every mistake narrowed the margin. Some men struggled mentally. The endless white erased perspective. There were no landmarks, no progress markers, just days blending into each other. One man broke down, convinced they would never leave the ice alive. Shackleton listened. He did not shame him. He did not isolate him. He reassigned duties, adjusted companionship, absorbed the emotional cost himself. Because if one man collapsed, others would follow. Winter passed in a blur of cold, hunger, and discipline. When spring returned, it did not bring relief. It brought danger. The ice began to break apart. Leads opened unexpectedly. Cracks formed beneath tents. What had once been solid became unstable. The surface they stood on was no longer dependable. The realization came quietly, but it was absolute. They could not stay. They would have to move across breaking ice toward open water in boats never meant for this journey. Standing on the drifting floe, Shackleton gathered the men. The expedition was over. Survival had begun. The ice they lived on was never still. It shifted beneath them while they slept. It cracked without warning. It breathed and groaned and reminded them constantly that it was not land, not something meant to be trusted. Every morning began with the same instinctive check, listening before opening their eyes, feeling for vibration, for the subtle movement that meant the flow had changed during the night. Their camp was temporary by design, even when it lasted weeks. Tents pitched lightly, supplies stacked for speed, not comfort. Nothing was arranged with permanence, because permanence no longer existed. They were guests on a surface that could evict them at any moment. Food became the center of thought. Not hunger yet, at least not at first, but calculation. How much remained? How slowly it could be eaten? How long it could be made to last if nothing improved? Meals were reduced carefully, not brutally. Shackleton understood that starvation destroyed morale long before it destroyed bodies. He needed the men thinking, moving, cooperating. So rations were cut just enough to feel. The dogs felt it first. They had been brought south as tools, strength, speed, hauling power. On the ship, they had been noisy, alive, irritating, comforting. On the ice, they became mouths. Calculations hardened. Conversations ended without conclusions. No one wanted to speak the final decision aloud. When it came quietly. One by one, the dogs were killed. Some for meat, some because they were injured, some because there was no other justification left. Men who had cared for them turned away during the act. Others volunteered to do it so their companions wouldn't have to. The meat was eaten without ceremony. Survival has a way of stripping sentiment from necessity. The ice camp moved when it had to, not when it wanted to. Shackleton ordered marches across the floes toward what he hoped was drifting north, toward open water, toward something that resembled a future. The marches were slow, exhausting, demoralizing. Boats dragged over ridges. Men slipped, fell, rose without comment. Progress was measured in yards. Sometimes they gained ground. Often they lost it overnight when the ice shifted back again. After days of effort, Shackleton stopped the marches. The cost was too high. He gathered the men and told them the truth, not all of it, but enough. They would wait again. They would conserve strength. They would adapt to the ice instead of fighting it. Some were relieved. Others were quietly crushed. Movement had at least created the illusion of control. Waiting stripped that illusion away. Days blurred into each other. The horizon never changed. White sky met white ground without contrast. Sound traveled strangely, bending distance. A crack might be nearby or miles away. Wind erased tracks instantly, swallowing evidence that anyone had ever moved at all. This was where minds began to fracture. One man grew convinced the ice was deliberately targeting them. Another withdrew entirely, speaking only when spoken to. Arguments flared over nothing, over how a tent was pitched, over whose turn it was to cook, over imagined slights that would have been laughed off in any other place. Shackleton adjusted constantly. He rotated tent groups to break simmering tensions. He paired strong personalities with quieter ones. He removed authority from those who used it poorly and redistributed it without explanation. Leadership here was not democratic. It was corrective. He also controlled hope. This was the most delicate task. Hope could not be eliminated. Without it, men lay down and stopped. But hope could not be allowed to grow wild. Shackleton never promised rescue, never promised success, never spoke of guarantees. He spoke instead of effort, of readiness, of being prepared for when opportunity appeared. Because if they were not ready, opportunity would pass them by without noticing. Hope had to be controlled, he understood, not promised. The ice did not care about their discipline. In late April, cracks began opening closer to camp. Thin black lines that widened overnight. The floe fractured into sections, separated by water that steamed faintly in the cold air. Shackleton ordered watches through the night. Boats were moved closer to tents. Supplies were stacked tighter. Sleep became rare. Then, one night, a crack opened beneath a tent. Men scrambled out as the ice split, the sound like tearing fabric magnified 100 times. The tent collapsed partially, swallowed at one corner. Nothing was lost that couldn't be replaced. But the message was clear. They were running out of time. Shackleton called the men together the next morning. He did not dramatize. He did not soften it. The ice was breaking up faster than expected. They could not wait for it to stabilize. When the next major split came, they would launch the boats ready or not. The boats were small, open, never meant for sustained ocean travel. They had been designed as lifeboats, not salvation, but they were all that remained. The men prepared with the dull efficiency of exhaustion. Personal items were abandoned. Keepsakes dropped into the snow without ceremony. Weight mattered. Space mattered. Anything that did not contribute directly to survival was discarded. When the ice finally forced the decision, it did not do so politely. A long crack opened through the camp, splitting the floe into separate islands. Water surged between them, Shackleton gave the order. Boats were launched into freezing water as men jumped in after them, hauling, pushing, slipping, swearing through numb lips. There was no hesitation left. They were leaving the ice. Behind them lay months of endurance, cold, hunger, discipline, and restraint. Ahead of them lay open water, exposure, and a new kind of terror. As the boats pulled away from the breaking flow, no one looked back for long. The ice was already forgetting them. The sea was worse than the ice. The ice had been cruel, but it had been predictable in its own slow way. It cracked, it drifted, it warned. The sea offered no such courtesy. The moment the boats left the floes, the men understood they had exchanged one kind of death for another, and there would be no return. The water was black and violent, thick with floating ice that slammed into the wooden hulls again and again. Waves rose without rhythm. Wind cut through clothing already stiff with salt and frost. The men were soaked constantly. There was no drying, no warmth, no escape. They rowed because they had to. They belayed because if they stopped, the boats would fill and sink. Hands bled, faces burned. Sleep became fragments measured in minutes, stolen while another man took the oars. Hunger sharpened. Thirst followed close behind. Fresh water was rationed down to mouthfuls that barely registered. There was no dignity left in their movements, only necessity. For days, the boats fought through the Weddell Sea, rising and falling, slamming into troughs so hard it felt as if their bones were being driven downward through their bodies. Men were thrown against each other, against the gunwales, against the cold fact that if one boat was lost, the others could not stop. Stopping meant dying. At last, land appeared not salvation, not safety, but something solid. Elephant Island. A place no one wanted to reach because no one ever came back from it. Steep cliffs, glaciers falling straight into the sea. No harbor, no vegetation, no shelter. They landed anyway. Men collapsed onto the beach, too exhausted to speak. Some cried quietly, some stared, some slept where they fell, bodies half buried in shingle and snow. They were alive, but only barely. And Shackleton knew the truth immediately. No one was coming for them here. Elephant Island was off all shipping routes. No whalers, no explorers, no chance encounter. If they stayed, they would disappear. So Shackleton made the decision that would define everything that followed. He would leave, not abandon them, but leave them behind. He chose 5 men, the strongest, the most resilient, the ones he trusted not just with skill, but with temperament. He did not choose friends. He chose survivors. The boat was modified as best they could. Raised sides, reinforced seams, a deck built from scraps to keep out the worst of the sea. Their destination was South Georgia, 800 miles away, across the most violent ocean on Earth, in a boat barely large enough to survive a day. If he failed, everyone on Elephant Island would die. When the boat pushed off, the men left behind did not cheer. They watched in silence as the tiny shape disappeared into gray distance. They understood exactly what it meant. This was not rescue. This was a gamble with no backup. The journey that followed stripped Shackleton and his men beyond exhaustion. Waves towered over them. Ice coated the boat, adding weight they had to chip away constantly or risk capsizing. Navigation was guesswork between brief glimpses of sun. Food was reduced to crumbs. Sleep was hallucinated more than experienced. Shackleton did not collapse. He could not afford to. Every decision was final. Course, speed, when to rest, when to push. He watched his men deteriorate and redistributed effort, absorbing more himself as others failed. Leadership here was not inspiring speeches. It was standing watch when your body begged to lie down and stop moving forever. After 16 days at sea, South Georgia appeared out of the storm like something imagined. Mountains rose suddenly from the water, too steep, too solid to be real. They landed on the wrong side of the island, the uninhabited side. No whaling stations, no help. And still, they were closer than they had ever been. 3 of the men were too weak to continue. Shackleton left them sheltered as best he could and set out across the island with 2 others. No map, no equipment for mountaineering, no food beyond scraps, just forward motion. They crossed mountains no one had ever crossed, slid down ice slopes blindly, climbed ridges where a single slip meant disappearance. They moved for 36 hours without sleep, driven by one thought alone. If they stopped, the others died. When they finally staggered into the whaling station, the men there did not recognize them as human at first. Bearded, hollow-eyed, reduced to something raw and shaking. Shackleton asked for help immediately, and then began the waiting again. Rescue attempts failed. Ice blocked ships. Weather turned them back. Each failure tightened the clock around the men still stranded on Elephant Island. Shackleton did not break. He tried again and again, until at last, months later, a ship forced its way through. When Shackleton stepped onto the beach and counted heads, he did not speak for a moment. Every man was there. They did not conquer Antarctica. They conquered despair. Crossing South Georgia was not a journey. It was an act of refusal. Shackleton, Tom Crean, and Frank Worsley moved like men already beyond their limits, bodies operating on something deeper than strength. They had been awake too long. They had eaten too little. Their clothes were stiff with salt and ice. Boots were worn thin, offering no real protection against rock and snow. But stopping was not an option, because stopping meant accepting an ending they were not willing to allow. The mountains did not offer paths. They rose sharply, jagged and unfamiliar, a maze of ridges and glaciers no one had ever mapped. Crevasses yawned open beneath thin snow bridges. Slopes dropped away into nothing. At times they slid blindly, using gravity as a tool, knowing it might kill them, but also knowing delay would kill others. They did not speak much. Speech required energy. Decisions did not. They climbed. They fell. They climbed again. When night came, they did not stop. They could not risk losing momentum. Shackleton calculated constantly angles, distances, daylight, exhaustion. Leadership here was not about reassurance. It was about moving first, taking the risk himself so the others could follow. After 36 hours without sleep, they heard something impossible. A whistle, not wind, not ice, a human sound. It stopped them cold. They stood there, 3 figures balanced between mountain and collapse, listening. The sound came again, machinery, civilization, proof that the world they had left months earlier still existed. When they stumbled into the whaling station at Stromness, the men there did not recognize them. These were not explorers. They were remnants, beards matted, eyes sunken, skin cracked and burned. Shackleton spoke simply. "My name is Shackleton." Help followed immediately, but relief did not. Not yet, because the hardest part still lay ahead. The men on Elephant Island were still waiting. Shackleton did not rest. He did not celebrate survival. Within days, he was planning rescue. The first attempt failed, ice too thick. The second failed, engine trouble. The third failed, weather closing in again. Each failure tightened the grip of time. Winter was coming back. Supplies on Elephant Island were limited. Every delay increased the chance that someone would break, physically or mentally. Shackleton absorbed the failures quietly. Publicly, he remained steady. Privately, the pressure was crushing. He did not allow himself the comfort of imagining success until success was real. Hope, again, was something to be controlled. Finally, on August 30, 1916, nearly 2 years after the Endurance had first become trapped, a small Chilean tug forced its way through the ice. Shackleton stood at the bow as Elephant Island came into view. Snow-covered, silent, unchanged, he scanned the beach and saw movement, figures, men, alive. When he stepped ashore, he did not give a speech. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He asked one question. "Are you all well?" Every man was accounted for. Not one death. In an environment that had erased ships, shattered plans, and crushed certainty, all of them had survived. Not because they were stronger than Antarctica. Not because they were lucky. Because leadership never let despair become policy. They did not cross the continent. They did not plant flags. They did not redraw maps. What they did was harder. They kept each other alive when survival seemed unreasonable. They endured hunger without turning on one another. They endured fear without surrendering to it. They endured leadership that never promised rescue, only effort, discipline, and responsibility. In the end, Antarctica was unchanged, vast, indifferent, untouched. But the men who left it were not the same. They had learned that survival is not heroic. It is collective. It is quiet. It is made of small decisions repeated every day under pressure. A leader's job is not to promise survival. It is to make it possible. And when everything else is stripped away, ships, missions, dreams, that is what endurance truly means. If there is a next story, it does not begin in ice. It begins afterward, when the noise returns, when crowds gather, when survival is translated into headlines and speeches that cannot carry the weight of what actually happened. The men go home. Some return to ordinary jobs. Some go back to sea. Some carry Antarctica quietly for the rest of their lives, waking at night to sounds no one else hears. Shackleton never speaks of conquest. He speaks of responsibility, of moments when no option feels right, but a choice still has to be made, of leadership measured not by success, but by who is still standing at the end, because survival does not end when danger ends. It lingers, and the question it leaves behind is not how did they survive, but something harder. What does it cost to bring everyone home alive? And what kind of person does that make you afterward? That is where the next story waits.